evening, everyone. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and I'm excited to welcome you to tonight's webinar featuring Nancy Koehn. Thanks for attending. For those of you new to FAN, a little bit of background. We're a nonprofit organization that presents a high-quality speaker series offered free to the public on topics related to human development, mental health, education, social justice, and many more. We have over 100 videos of past events archived on our website and our YouTube channel, so please be sure to explore those. A few housekeeping notes. We are recording tonight's webinar, and in a few days, the link will be sent to everyone who registered. We will also post the video on our website and YouTube channel for free public viewing. I'd like to take a moment to reflect with considerable sadness upon the passing of the beloved civil rights leader, Congressman John Lewis, on July 17th. Congressman Lewis fought for a moral, social, and racial revolution with deep faith and hope. His body was brutally beaten and scarred. He was arrested more than 40 times, and yet his message was always one of love in action. FAN had the privilege of hosting Congressman Lewis in 2016 and 2017, and his impact on our communities cannot be overstated. A favorite quote: "Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Do not become bitter or hostile. Be hopeful, be optimistic, never ever be afraid to make some noise and get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble. We will find a way to make a way out of no way. May he rest in power." It's now my pleasure to introduce Nancy Koehn, a renowned historian at Harvard Business School, who was last here in November of 2017 in conjunction with the launch of Forged in Crisis. At the first of 3 appearances in a single day for FAN, she spoke to hundreds of Evanston Township High School civics and AP US history students. Unprompted, she had previously arranged for her publisher to provide 280 copies of the book to students and faculty at ETHS. Trust me, this is highly unusual, yet as I came to know Professor Koehn, it is unsurprising. After the ETHS talks, she and I traveled to downtown Chicago for a lunch and learn at one of our corporate sponsors, where she exhorted a room full of polished finance professionals to become authentic leaders, not merely financially successful. And it is my fervent hope that they took good notes. That evening at her final event, Professor Koehn unspooled the stories of the 5 individuals she profiles in Forged in Crisis: Ernest Shackleton, Rachel Carson, Abraham Lincoln, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and Frederick Douglass. She describes a number of crucible moments when character is revealed and leaders are formed. Those present were transfixed, gobsmacked, and energized. Look, it's clear I adore Nancy Koehn. When COVID forced the cancellation of 14 speakers and 20 events this past spring, I faced tremendous uncertainty about how to navigate this new and terrible terrain. Almost immediately, though, my email inbox started blowing up with Google alerts about Nancy. Crisis leadership is her specialty, and she is in huge demand. I ingested everything: her new webinars, new articles, and social media posts, and I've been collecting her ongoing Leading Yourself in Crisis insights, now numbering over 120. She has been my North Star for leading FAN. When Professor Koehn emailed me a few months ago offering her services to FAN if it would be helpful to our community, I burst out crying at my keyboard, no joke. Helpful? Her tremendous generosity of spirit, her commitment to her work, her deep love of history, and her nuanced understanding of leadership. Yes, yes, yes to all of that. Tonight, Nancy will offer a 30-minute talk and will then be joined on screen for an interview by one of FAN's very favorite collaborators, Tom Flema, head of school at North Shore Country Day School in Winnetka, Illinois. An historian by training, Tom worked for 17 years at the Hotchkiss School in Connecticut, where he taught American history, coached, lived in the dormitory, and served as associate head of school. In 2016, he moved to Winnetka to become the 9th head of school at North Shore Country Day, a JK through 12 school that just celebrated its centennial. So with no further ado, and with deep pleasure and honor, let's welcome Professor Nancy Koehn.
Thank you so much, Lonnie. I really appreciate the kind introduction. It's a real privilege to be here with FAN and in the tremendous highway that you have created and that you drive so capably. So so extraordinarily along in terms of bringing ideas and provocative thoughts and dignity and moral purpose to hundreds and hundreds of people. It's a thrill to be here, so thank you. Dear friends, I want to talk to you for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes or so we have plenty of time for a fireside chat with Tom, which we're all looking forward to, and also for some questions. I want to talk to you a little bit about leading courageously in crisis. I've been thinking about it and studying it for a long, long time, and historians, and I'm now, aging as we speak, historians get better as we get older because we have more experience, more mileage, more perspective, more stories, and we get paid to see the big picture. And so what I want to talk to you about for our time here is first a couple of broad thoughts about this moment, and then some simple, easily accessible, use them tomorrow, try out the ones that have some resonance for you, rules of the road for leading in this extraordinary crisis. So let me start off with some appetizers. The first one is, this is a seismic event. It is on par with the First or Second World War. It is a massive inflection point for the globe. In fact, the more I think about it as a war, the more I'm struck by the analogies or the parallels. We're fighting an enemy. It's not people. It's not a League of Nations. It's not, an axis of powers. It's an incredibly efficient, ruthlessly effective virus that knows no zip code, knows no political, party, knows very, very little about specific boundaries, with the exception of attacking specific vulnerable people, usually people that don't sit at power tables. But we're in a fight, and it's an extraordinary fight. And more important than even the fight is the fact that, like the First World War or the Second World War, it's remaking our world. We are in America right now. I was saying to Lonnie in the few minutes before the webinar started, I was saying I feel like that, Joan Didion's book title, Lurching Toward Jerusalem, I feel like we're lurching into COVID-19 farther and farther into the danger zone. But as we do, as that begins to happen, all kinds of things are changing massively. And not just in relation to the virus, although the virus, in a sense, was the lighter fuel on the embers that got so many fires going. And I'm not just talking about the economic crisis that's following in its wake. And I'm not just talking about the critical campaign for justice and equality that's also, spiraling very powerfully, very importantly along as COVID does. But all kinds of other things are changing. And so we are lurching our way into a post-COVID world. And I think that the first point is, let's release ourselves from a new normal or from back to normal, and start thinking about, what do we want the post-COVID world to be? The second thing I want to offer you, much more briefly, is that I learned early on in the lockdown that the word apocalypse in Greek means revelation. Think about that for a second. In a crisis of this magnitude, all kinds of things, you can think about 6 of them right now, are being revealed, including organizations that deserve our trust, leaders that deserve our trust or do not, right? The moral ballasts, the character and the competence of all kinds of people who sit at the power table. All of that is being revealed, and none of that will be forgotten. Despite the tsunami of information, despite our increasing proclivity to live in very, very small time intervals, this will not be forgotten. So a lot is being revealed. The third appetizer I want to offer you is that, as Lonnie said, I spent a long time writing a book. My last book, Forged in Crisis, was the stories of 5 individuals, ordinary people who did extraordinary things. And in the process of doing that, in an unexpected, completely surprising personal crisis, they made themselves better. Because here's the third point. Crises turn out to be very powerful crucibles for all of us to actually get better. Because leaders of all shapes and sizes and all walks of life are made, they're not born. And I'm not exactly sure, in kind of careful vector by vector, a vector by vector teleology, how it is that crises are such powerful greenhouses for the making, right, of individuals. But I know they are, and the closest I can get to explaining it at a broad level is to quote Lincoln, who I know very well. You know, he said in the middle of the Civil War, a particularly bad moment militarily for the North, he said, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew." And that is what crises seem to do for certain people and the people that follow them. They seem to be a moment when the stakes are high, the uncertainty is all around, there is great, there are fundamental values and fundamental things at risk in which people raise the level of their game from the inside out and then affecting the outside, and then inspire other people to do the same thing. You know, David Foster Wallace said in an article he wrote in 2000 for Rolling Stone, he said, "Real leaders, courageous leaders, are individuals who help us overcome the limitations of our own weaknesses, selfishness, laziness, and fears, and get us to do harder, better things than we can get ourselves to do on our own." And that's what happens in crises. Individuals rise up. Think Lincoln, think Ernest Shackleton, who's the first story in my book. This screen, this picture behind me that's projected on the screen is actually a picture of a rowboat that was reconstructed, that was based on a rowboat that Shackleton, this Antarctic explorer, used to make the impossible possible on a journey he took to rescue his men in 1916. So individuals rise, and others, taking inspiration, taking courage, being grounded by those leaders, rise as well. So, third point, this is a moment for each of us and the people that we lead, our family members, our students, our teachers, our community actors, our employees, to rise up and make a real difference. One other thing I want to add here, and then I want to go quickly through the rules of the road. Crises are, as Lincoln said, crises are moments when we must disenthrall ourselves, right, and rise to a new plane. And in doing that, right, we redefine the world after the crisis. So what we do, as Lincoln said a year later, what we do today is not altogether for the struggle of today. It is for a vast future. So these actions that we take now, these decisions we take now, the entities and the people we trust have huge ramifications going forward, much more powerful consequences than they did even 8 months ago. All right, let me mention a series here of rules of the road, pertaining to, applicable to, usable by all kinds of leaders. Because leaders, as I said earlier, come in many shapes and sizes. I've known chemo nurses who were some of the most courageous leaders I've ever met. I've known school principals who were some of the most courageous leaders. I've known firefighters. So this is not about just the folks in the C-suite or just the folks at the governmental power table, the financial power table. So let me begin with this. First rule of the road: get very comfortable quickly with uncertainty and volatility, and therefore get very comfortable with navigating point to point, right? You're going to have a plan for where you're headed, but the winds may rise, the waves may grow, and you may have to tack in a different direction. So get comfortable, help your people, your children, your kids, your employees, your followers get comfortable with navigating point to point and switching directions as needed. All the while, rule number one, learning forward as we go. So navigate point to point, suppleness and flexibility as we need to steer into clearer, calmer waters, and learning forward as we do. Rule number two, as we do this, as we make these tough decisions, as we make a plan, because there is no GPS for navigating, say, opening schools. It's not like you plug it into Waze and then the directions come out and you follow those directions. As we navigate point to point, heading toward our North Star, we are grounded, rooted more firmly now than in moments before, because the stakes are so high. The stakes, my friends, which I don't hear many public leaders talking about. The stakes are not their life and death and our very well-being here in COVID-19. Our health, our economy, those are not mutually exclusive things. Those are aligned goals, but these are very, very high stakes. When we're navigating through these stormy waters, we are grounded in our mission. We are talking about our mission and we are grounded in our mission. So rule number 2, lock your legs in place, get your core tight in that kind of athlete's position and standing on the firm ground of your mission and your values. Rule number 3, it is critically important that you communicate much more than you think you should. Whether we're talking about your children at the dinner table, whether we're talking about your team at work, whether we're talking about your teachers, if you're Tom and you're making difficult or complicated decisions about opening your school, whoever we are leading and we are responsible for. And some of those people may not even be conscious that you're leading. We want to communicate frequently, more frequently than we think. We want to communicate with a regular cadence. This is getting more and more and more important as the American COVID drama gets darker and more complicated and seemingly, right, so poorly led in many different pockets and so confusing in terms of the communication that ordinary citizens are receiving and making decisions on. So communicate frequently, communicate in a regular cadence. Think about Franklin Delano Roosevelt's fireside chats, or think about Winston Churchill's radio announcements. Even Lincoln had a regular cadence to the way he communicated, which was primarily through newspaper articles and speeches that were published in newspapers. So regular cadence, more frequent than you think you need to be, and always consisting of 2 critical, ineluctable elements, not separable, right? Brutal honesty, right? Here are the challenges today. Here are the challenges tomorrow. Here are the constraints on our ability to act around those challenges. Here is what we're trying to do in the face of those challenges. Here are the materials we lack and the materials we have for meeting those challenges. Brutal honesty. Winston Churchill once walked into Parliament to give us a report on the military situation in France in the spring of 1940 with these words: "The news from France is very bad." That brutal honesty is essential because people have very good Geiger counters, very good filters for testing what is true and what is not. So you owe them brutal honesty, and sitting right next to brutal honesty is if you will, the other side of the balance sheet is credible hope. Credible hope, what's that mean? That means, what are the resources, often intangible, that we bring as a group of people to the table to deal with the challenge, right? That is unity, our discipline, our commitment to the purpose, our resilience, our sense of grit and perseverance, the often intangible resources that we bring that leaders have to name: credible hope, brutal honesty, in order to have people kind of square their shoulders, tighten their core, and do better, harder things than they would do on their own. So brutal honesty, credible hope, extraordinarily important. Think for a second, just to give you an example of where I've seen this done very, very well recently, is Andrew Cuomo's press briefings. Now there's a man who a year and a half ago was not on my watch list for crisis leaders. But there's someone who seems to be getting better and better and better and better. I watched every single press briefing that he's had, and I'm amazed at how he's become not only Mr. Brutal Honesty, but also Mr. Credible Hope, right? Part strategist, part weatherman, part ship's navigator, part minister, part school principal, part here's how you wear a mask. It's not on your chin, it's here. So brutal honesty, credible hope, think of them as 2 sides of the balance sheet of frequent, regular, expected communication in the same meeting. Okay, so that's rule number 3. Rule number 4. These are all equally important, but you'll use them as you see fit. Rule number 4 is think for a second about how you're showing up. So what do I mean by that? I mean that individuals take their cues from leaders. Your kids do this when you walk into the kitchen to have breakfast. Your students do this when Tom walks into the auditorium or gets on the webinar. Your employees do this whenever they see you in any context, now largely perhaps virtual. They take their cues from more than what you say and more than what you do. They take your cues from how you hold your body. They take their cues from your energy. They take their cues from your facial expression. They take their cues from all those countless, right, aspects of your bearing and your energy that you bring to every interaction. And so I always say to people, particularly in high stakes situations when our filters, our antennae are extra sensitive and we are extra absorbing of signals from the people that we have given trust and authority to, I always say, show up in service to your mission. So even when you walk into the breakfast family and had a terrible night's sleep, your kids are looking up at you. They're waiting to see, where's mom, where's dad, right? Show up in service to your mission. Leaders in crisis of all walks of life do not have the luxury in many, many contexts of, if you will, exposing your own raw, difficult, exhausting, confusing emotions. So you're showing up in service to your mission. Your voice, your body language, the whole package is incredibly important. And again, I'd ask you just briefly, think about a couple of different crisis leaders you've witnessed on television or on the internet and compare notes. Who's the one you want to follow and who's the one you don't? And some of it is about how you show up. So that is extraordinarily important. And yet, very, very, very easy. Especially in these kind of moments when there's so much going on, it's so easy to lose our moorings, to lose our bearings. It's so easy to forget this. So let me end here. I want to end and to leave us plenty of time for conversation. Let me end with one last rule of the road. I think this is 7. You remember when 8 months ago when many of us were on airplanes and you got to the end of the runway and the flight attendant was just finishing up the little pre-flight announcements, and he or she said, in the event of oxygen pressure falling in the cabin, an oxygen mask will fall from, in the event of pressure falling in the cabin, an oxygen mask will fall from the ceiling. Please place the band around your head. Please secure your oxygen mask before you help others. So that's the point of this last rule of the road. Leaders, again, of any purpose and any mission, any worthy mission, have to feed and water themselves. And what do I mean by that? This is really important. There are so many people depending on you. That means a number of things. So this rule of the road has a few subcategories. First, you need to get enough sleep and you need to eat healthy food. That's really important. And especially as this crisis, which is not a short story. This is not a No. Henry story. It may not be War and Peace, but it's a real hefty Dickens novel in terms of its projected length. So we're in a long story here, a long journey. You're staying healthy physically is absolutely essential. Your energy being as good as it can be in the morning and then managing that through the day is absolutely essential. So first subcategory, eat and sleep, eat well and sleep enough. Second subcategory, right? Get some time away from your device every day. And I don't mean 5 minutes. I don't mean I put my phone down, I've turned it over and I'm done in 5 minutes, I need to pick it up. I mean 20 minutes device free. And please, while you do that, take a walk. I'm a kind of historian by hobby of famous walkers. And it turns out all kinds of famous people, from the great architect Frederick Olmsted to Charles Dickens writing Origin of Species, to Steve Jobs, a different kind of leader, a different kind of thinker, inventing the iPhone, all those people walk. Mobility is incredibly useful for not only lowering, right, our anxiety levels, acknowledged or unconscious, but also clearing our head and helping us kind of stand on the ground again, clear-headed and focused. So subcategory 3, device-free moments. Subcategory 4, leaders need recovery moments. You need recovery time. So Lincoln used to recover from the pressures of the Civil War by going to the theater, or late at night because he didn't sleep well. He did not follow subcategory number 1 of feeding and watering yourself. Lincoln used to walk the halls and sing of the White House second floor and sing bawdy songs or tell raunchy jokes to his secretaries who slept along with the family along that hall. So whatever, I know many business leaders that like to play music or play the guitar, stand on the driveway and watch your daughter on her bicycle, whatever it is that I personally am reading a lot of really, really romantic Victorian novels and watching a lot of Harrison Ford movies at night. So whatever it is that takes you away from this moment and your responsibilities and the larger, complicated, exhausting, often disillusioning picture of America at this moment, not completely disillusioning at all, but it's certainly in terms of COVID, whatever it is that takes you away is actually an investment in your work tomorrow, an investment in your people, an investment in your family. So building recovery time in is critical, just like getting some grounded time away from your device and some walking and feeding and watering yourself well and sleeping. So taking good care of yourself is absolutely essential. Last benediction before I graciously and gladly turn this over to Tom. The world, no one's telling you this, so I need to tell you this. The world has never needed you and will never need you again, because this is such a powerful moment and so much is up for grabs. The world has never needed you and will never need you again in the same way to be the best you can be. We have never needed your leadership in a myriad of ways more than we do now. So let me pause there.
Hello. Professor Koehn, thanks so much for those words. I think we've learned already more than I was expecting in a very short period of time, and really appreciate your guidance and your thought and your optimism, especially. And that's something that I hope that we can come back to. I'd like to start maybe by connecting two of the things together that you've mentioned so far, and that's communications and reflection. You've written in a number of places how those are really crucial elements for leadership during a crisis. And one of the things it seems like is that the time frame that leaders have today to make decisions or make pronouncements has really been shrunk by social media, by 24-hour news, by this instant news flash. What advice do you have for leaders out there who might be trying to stem the tide as they're trying to make thoughtful, reasoned decisions in this instant communication era?
It's a great question, Tom. I think the first thing I would say, and from all my years of studying leaders past and present, is one of your most unsung and still powerful tools as a leader is your control of pace, of speed. So if you study, I'm just by happenstance, although I think Kurt Vonnegut once said that anyone who believes in coincidences isn't paying attention, so perhaps it isn't a coincidence. I happen to be writing at the very beginning of the year, starting a case on the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was looking at the emotional awareness and forbearance of JFK and a few other key actors in what was called the executive committee, the people making decisions about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Kennedy figured out, right, with a group of military folks that were really pressuring him to act fast and resort to military retaliation for these nuclear missiles found in Cuba. Kennedy realized you can slow things down. And every leader can slow things down. Every leader can speed things up. That's more of a default speed, velocity for our time, as you said. But Lincoln had enormous pressure on him to move quickly at lots of points. Again, relative speed at the time, but pressure for him to speed up. And he, like Kennedy, like Churchill, like Katharine Graham, making a decision about whether to publish those Pentagon papers in the early 1970s, just kind of said, whoa, first inside, and then figured out a way, not always directly, not always by fiat, to slow things down. So my rule of the road on this is when the stakes get really high and there's a lot of pressure, the first thing you do is do nothing in the moment, right? You buck all the social media and all the seduction of our lovers, which says, act now, act immediately. You just find the discipline to say, no, I'll do nothing in this instant. And then you create the space and the time you need to make a complicated decision. Pace.
Pace. Yeah, easier said than done, to be sure. When you mention, and I think my inner historian comes out, when you mention Lincoln and Kennedy together, we think of both of those presidents in some ways as giants, but, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy was not necessarily seen as the strongest leader. Lincoln was about to lose the war before things shifted pretty dramatically in 1864. So we now consider them to be great leaders, but history has a way to remake our conceptions of the past given our present lens. Do you think all of these traits that you identify about great leaders in crisis moments are going to be sustained? Are they going to as central and timeless, or might some of these traits be revised as you think about the next generation, looking back at the leaders we're talking about today?
I'd be willing to bet my Welsh Springer Spaniels and my horses, and the wardrobe I don't really wear very much because I'm mostly on Zoom. I'd be willing to bet a lot of the creatures that are part of my family and my material possessions, that these do not change. We want to think we're so special. That's always people's reaction. We're so unique. Our moment is so unique. What did Twain say, or no, Faulkner? The past does not repeat itself precisely, but sometimes it does rhyme. There's so many rhymes. We are not the first, and we're not. And these crisis leadership behaviors, they're behaviors. They're not. They're not cut in stone. They're not holy tablets. There's nothing terribly special about these, except that we have seen. I and lots of other people have seen them be useful and effective in so many high stakes situations. So no, I think these will stand the test of time, Tom. They will not be overturned.
One of the other things, and we were talking about that sort of historical perspective. One of the things that I'm interested of, and we were talking about, or I was going to try to get us to the point where we were talking about ordinary people, and that moment of, are these behaviors learned? How are they learned? I'm also really curious, because we're in a moment now where young people are really stepping into the forefront. And, as a school leader, I'm particularly attuned to that. And I'm certainly optimistic about our world, knowing so many of these younger kids. What advice do you give to high school students, to middle school students, who aren't necessarily maybe thinking of themselves as leaders yet, but who want to make positive change?
First thing I give, and this is not self-serving, is to find some story in history and follow the story. History is just an astoundingly well done, well told, well taught. History is an extremely important, not only inspiration, I think, for young people, it's also a way of expanding their sense of self and what they can be. Because, the majority of most, what all kinds of people would call admirable, significant, ordinary people who did extraordinary things, the vast majority of our heroes, right, broadly defined, were people who didn't start off with a huge leg up. Right, who didn't think of themselves, at 10 or 12 or 17 as some kind of incredibly important person, and they weren't told they were. So I think it's kind of a 1-2 for the price of one. You get access to the sweep of time and the possibilities that have happened to other generations. You get inspired by people doing interesting, unusual, creative, impossible things, and you get a sense that most great leaders were ordinary people. And I think that's very, very important for our young people today in our celebrity-obsessed culture, which says that you don't really matter unless you start off with 100,000 Facebook friends and 100,000 Twitter followers. Leadership isn't about that. And leading a really satisfying life, doing really good work isn't about that. So just a little bit of some good stories from history is a great place to start.
Yeah, and certainly some of the role models that you can find, that kids can identify in history, but also, to your point of looking around, who are our role models today? Who do we look to for inspiration? One of the things I've been thinking a little bit about recently is, as we've watched the national responses to COVID around the world, one of the strands, or one of the stories that we've heard, is that there are a number of nations who are led by women who have done extraordinary jobs against coronavirus. And, I think of Denmark and Norway and
New Zealand, Germany.
Yeah, I didn't mean Norway, I meant New Zealand. Yeah. Germany for sure. How do you think about the intersection of gender and common conceptions and misconceptions about leadership?
Well, let me worm my way in there, skulk my way into that question by saying, I think one of the reasons that Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand or Angela Merkel in Germany have been so successful in taming, flattening, crushing is a little strong, really flattening the curve and allowing measured, frequently tested reopening to happen successfully, and small outbreaks or returns to quickly get flattened again, is because first, they have this extraordinary respect for the stakes, which are about life and health. And economy follows from life and health. And they just haven't played fast and loose with those stakes, which are the essential guardrails of this crisis, well-being. They haven't played fast and loose with that. And there's lots and lots of examples of this aspect of women leaders that I think is really important. So I think that's the first piece. I think there's a second piece too, and that is that I think women are much, much better. And there's a lot now beginning to be empirical evidence about this, much better at consultative decision making. Not meaning they're going to make the decision in concert with a bunch of people, but they're going to consult with a lot of people and listen well before they make the decision. And a crisis that's generated by a virus is absolutely ineluctably dependent on scientific and medical expertise. And that expertise is changing even day by day in some cases as scientists and medical folks learn much more about the virus. Women, statistically, empirically, are much better at taking in a wide variety of evidence, advice, points of view, and making decisions from that. So I think there's a pace and a kind of consultative, even a reflective piece that's it's important in lots of moments. It's particularly important with this kind of enemy.
And we get back to that reflective piece again,
Yeah.
that inside out sort of trajectory that you talked about before.
I think there's one other thing, Tom. I'm just thinking of Jacinda Ardern and Angela Merkel. They've both been able to do the credible hope piece in a very humane way. I mean, they're very different styles, but this idea not only about compliance, right, and which is critical. They've been very consistent. I talked about the rule, the communications rule of the road, but also they've been able to do it in a very humane way that recognizes, right, the emotional aspects of this crisis for those that have had the disease or been debilitated by it or lost people to it, as well as those that don't know very much about the disease and haven't been confronted with it, which is a huge piece of, I think, the compliance issue in some cases. And so they've handled that piece very well. I think the emotional side, which is important, and they've been very articulate about it in a way a lot of male leaders across the board have, we're going to give them a C or a C+.
Well, with great inflation, maybe a B-.
Maybe a B-.
Let's, gentlemen's B-. Are you optimistic? Are you optimistic about where we're headed? You used World War I and World War II as analogies. those were not always universally upwards in trajectory afterwards.
No. They were very expensive. Think of the death and destruction.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, in the aftermath, right?
No, that's right. I am optimistic I think I have credible hope. Let's put it that way, right? What did John Lewis say? We need a buoyant hope, but he wasn't talking about a hope that wasn't grounded in the hard, messy, serious, exhausting work of trying to make social change. I'm optimistic because I think the world is going to need and not settle for less than a different kind of Marshall Plan, a different kind of rebuilding. A lot hinges on America's role, right? As massively transformed as that's been in the last 4 years. And, and there was transformation going on anyway, but is massively, a lot hinges on America's role, but it's by no means an American story anymore. But the world is going to be so much better off with a global Marshall Plan. And we're going to need that, and we're going to need to do the hard work. It's political, it's scientific, it's behavioral, it's multifaceted, and we're going to have to do it at home, right? We see the tectonic plates opening up around the campaign for justice and equality, around the possibility of public health, around a new approach to the environment that really steps up, right, our efforts one by one and organization by organization. But that's hard work. Like, it's really like, roll your sleeves up. You're going to be up to here in the hard work. And so it depends on all those things, but it has to be fueled, right, by credible hope, because no one's going to do the work without the vision and without the mission and without the leaders who make them do harder, better things. But yes, because of all that, I am optimistic. We can build something really, really good here. And we have no time to waste.
No. And I do think, circling back to the idea of the next generation and the next generation, I think there's something very poignant about losing John Lewis at this moment, when there has been, a real, perhaps, moment and opportunity for change in terms of racial justice. So I think I'm optimistic too, but that's what being in education, I think, really, really helps.
Yeah, and Lewis was saying as recently as June was talking about the next generation of folks ready to carry the standard and do the work and stand in the streets and work toward not only justice and equality, but the beloved community. I mean, he is talking about a profound change, as were lots and lots of the original civil rights workers and lots of folks today, Brian Stevenson, talking about a profound change in the community that we live in. And it's an extraordinarily inspirational and luminous vision that he has held out, and that people like Stevenson and even Darren Walker at the Ford Foundation are holding out.
And Brian Stevenson is another fan favorite. He's
I know.
A fan, another bit. Lonnie, I see you jumping on. Do we have time for one last 10-second question?
Always have time, Tom.
So if there's, Professor Koehn, if there's a sequel for Forged in Crisis, who are your next 5? Who would you hold up to us as another group of inspirational leaders that we can take lessons from?
Well, I'm gonna write a Harvard Business School case about Greta Thunberg, because she's a courageous leader with, again, that's a story that I'd like to be teaching all kinds of high school students talk about. And it hasn't been easy. What she's doing hasn't been easy, and her life has been very complicated and full of lots of vulnerabilities and failures. And she's moving the boulder of goodness in extraordinary ways at the age of 18. So she's someone I'm watching and follow. I'm doing a lot of work on Brian Stevenson, because I think he's someone that the world of young people and the world of business executives, which is one of Harvard Business School's primary audiences, we need to know more about him and about his work and about what fuels, right, his sense of purpose, which is so extraordinarily powerful and so indefatigable, so resilient, and so loving, so loving. Let's just bring that word out again. So loving. So I'm sniffing from a public source perspective around Mr. Stevenson because I respect him so much. And I would put Katharine Graham in there too. Her story that's not a story of someone who started at the bottom. She started with lots and lots of resources, but she never ever expected to be a leader, someone who would have the kind of impact and be able to display the kind of integrity she did. And she grew into that. Right. She grew into it against all kinds of odds and all kinds of naysayers. And I think her story, like in some ways Melinda Gates, those are good stories for young women to learn about now.
Great. Thanks so much.
Yeah, pleasure.
All right, so I'm going to unmute myself. We're going to probably run, just for folks watching the clock, we're going to run just a couple minutes late, both because Nancy froze and I got a little clumped and long-winded up at the front end. But, you know, it's kind of hard when you have such an incredible human being here on the screen that you want to give all honor to. So I'm going to ask a couple questions that were in Q&A.
Great.
A quick reminder, if you want to join the after hours event with Professor Koehn and Tom Flumma, afterwards, it's going to start probably in 5, 6, 7 minutes from now. You can purchase a copy of Nancy's book, Forged in Crisis, from the bookstall, and your receipt, there'll be a link to register for the after hours. It's a meeting, so it's a little bit more casual. It's not going to be like a webinar. It'll be, chat will be open 2 ways. You'll see everybody's faces, so it's a little bit more casual, the gathering. So now, with no further ado, Nancy, I got a couple, so let's do this as the lightning round. And I know you're up. All right, so the question that got 3 likes from other folks, from Laura. Can you please expand on the idea of learning forward?
Sure. Excuse my dogs in the background. Agility. Learning forward. How this works, this doesn't. Let's try this out. So, for example, what are we learning on Zoom? It took us 3 or 4 weeks, all of us that were doing webinars, to learn that keeping the energy high on Zoom was a whole new kind of can of worms. So how do we do that? And what are the things we can do early in a webinar to get people's energy up? And then how do we start to bring that in to our presentations and the way we work together on Zoom? That's just one tiny example. I'll give you another one. Very early in the lockdown in this country, I have a couple of good doctor friends, and I got access to these emails that were starting to come around the emergency room computers about how you treat COVID patients. So by the end of March, people were starting to turn COVID patients in New Orleans and in Boston over on their stomachs, prone them when they were having trouble breathing. And that actually really helped their lungs and helped their oxygen absorption levels. Learning forward, putting it into action, testing it, moving forward. All over the place. We have to get very agile at doing that and then testing it and then incorporating it.
Okay, here's another question from Wendy from Q&A today. Talking about the necessary leadership of ordinary people, would you please talk a little bit about the marches calling for racial justice and how they are creating change that leaders have been calling for decades? And do you think that women, for example, the ones leading Black Lives Matter and the mothers protesting in Portland, are helping to create this change?
So I think you answered your own question. You said it very, very well. Yes, yes, and yes to the last question. I mean, those women in Portland, those women leading Black Lives Matter, those women standing there in all those marches, all those, think of all those mayors standing out on the street, those female mayors standing out on the streets. You bet that's creating change. You bet that is even the most discriminating and base leaders in our national government, I'm using a plural there, have not been able to ignore the power of those that kind of expression, that kind of demand for change. And I don't see any end to that. I don't think this is a fashion. I don't think this is a cause célèbre. I don't think it's going away. If it was, Barr would never be sending his secret police to Portland. So yes and yes on change, and that is about ordinary people, right? You know, making the kind of change and breaking up the plates of the established order in order to move towards something like a beloved community, the first steps of that.
Okay, and I'm gonna hit you with one more. We're at 8:01. I think we got time for one more, and then we'll be saying our goodbyes and getting ready to go into the after hours. This is from Noah. He says, thank you for sharing your work with us tonight. It seems more needed than ever. I'm wondering if you found any specific approaches successful leaders take to balancing authenticity with projecting an inspiring or aspirant front during crises. They both are important, but pose a challenging balance to find.
It certainly does, and it's a great question. All the questions are spot on, Noah. Let me just say that I think that leaders are authentic in many ways. Authentic, we sort of want to think. My students at Harvard want to think authentic means I just show up and I tell you how I feel. That's not authentic. Authentic is speaking from your purpose and your best self, right? And heading in the direction, harder, better things that you believe is the best place you can head toward, right? On the higher road of your life and your gifts and your experiences. So being authentic, it means that you have the self-discipline and perhaps a little bit of the acting talents to show up in an inspiring, grounding way. Because a lot of what leaders do by showing up is like this, is calm the people that are watching them, help them actually become part of the solution. Remember Roosevelt, we have nothing to fear but fear itself, nameless, shapeless fear that paralyzes attempts to find solutions. So being authentic and showing up, even if you don't feel really confident at that moment, is actually living your mission. Now, your question still has another piece to it, and that is, what in the hell does a leader do with his confusion or his despair or his I don't know how we're going to get through the day, much less the month. So the answer to that is you have to find a way, again, to put those feelings, put them in a safe place, talk to your partner, right? Lincoln used to sing to his dog. You have to find a way to release those feelings because they're important, but they can't go into the town hall meeting and they can't begin your webinar with your followers. So you have them, you have to walk into them, but you also have to show up with all those eyes and all those antennae on you in service to your mission. Remember, your purpose, your better self is your most authentic self.
So everyone, Nancy Koehn is coming back for FAN on September 17th. It's a Thursday night. It will be part 2. This is part 1, part 2. Nancy, why don't you give them a quick teaser as to what's happening?
So here's what I thought I would do, and please feel free to, log into Lonnie or me and tell me what we do. But I thought we'd talk first about the emotional energy, the emotional journey of living through the COVID story, right? Now, as parents, as employers, as community activists, as ordinary human beings. So we're going to talk about that. I'm going to offer some rules of the road and some perspective and a few examples of leaders and individuals navigating long game crises. And the second thing I thought we'd do related to that is talk, and this is in relation to the kind of questions we've had here tonight, is talk about what do we need to do to marshal our energies so that we can start creating the change we want in the post-COVID world, right? It's not too early to talk about a template for how we're going to make a more equitable world in the office, in our public health system, in our school system. It's not too early to start mapping that out, in more than just the sketchiest whiteboard terms. And so how are we going to galvanize ourselves and not be defeated by the energy and the destruction of this disease and the disappointment many of us have in many leaders and in some of our fellow citizens in regard to compliance or whatever? How are we going to galvanize our energy to make the change? And what are some ideas about what that change is going to look like? That's what we're going to do in round 2, chapter 2.
Thank you. Tom Flemma, thank you so much for your service to the FAN community, which is now a big national community. Thank you for your service and your friendship, your collaboration with FAN. Nancy Koehn, love
Pleasure.
You.
Thank you, folks. Sorry about my internet.
No, you're good. And for those of you joining the after hours, we'll see you in just a couple minutes. The fan producers are going to flip up a quick 2-minute PowerPoint here, and we're going to close out everything here. So thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thanks, everyone.
Lonnie.
See you next week for Eddie Glaude. See you next week. Thanks, everyone.